So just to recap step 6, we added our precipitate to the filter after the filter was turned on and filter paper was added and wet down. And we pushed the filters down just to increase the suction. And then we washed the remaining precipitate out of the beaker with some distilled water and added it to the filters. And to just make sure that all the acid is out of your sample, you can add some distilled water just to cover the top of your sample and let that filter through as well. Once the precipitate seems relatively dry, press the precipitate down with the bottom of a small beaker. And then remove a small amount of sample just to save for a melting point determination later. Keep pressing the sample down with the bottom of the beaker until you don't see any more water dripping from the bottom of the filter. So once your precipitate is dry, we can turn the filter off. And transfer the precipitate into a beaker. Make sure to transfer only the precipitate and not the filter paper. This should be done for both filters, but just for our purposes, I'm only going to show one of them. Once all the precipitate is transferred, we can put this on a hot plate with our water ethanol mixture and slowly add about 70 to 75 milliliters of this mixture until our precipitate disappears or dissolves. So once your precipitate is completely dissolved in the solution, we can take it off the hot plate and let it cool. So just to recap, once we finished filtering the precipitate, we added it to a beaker and then added our water ethanol mixture and heated it up to just before boiling. And we stirred the solution until we had added about 75 milliliters of our mixture and until all the precipitate had dissolved. Then we took it off the hot plate and let it cool until we just started to see crystals forming. And now, once we see the crystals, we can put our beaker into an ice bath to let it finish cooling. We're putting it in the ice bath so that all the precipitate will come out and we can get all the crystals, so we can filter them again. So once it's been in the ice bath for about 10 minutes and the bottom of the beaker feels cool to touch, we'll filter the crystals in the same way we did before with the precipitate. This will give us a sample of pure salicylic acid. So just to recap step 7, we recrystallized our solution our precipitate by putting it on the hot plate and adding the water and ethanol mixture and dissolving it until it reached just before boiling and all the precipitate had dissolved. And then we took it off the hot plate, and once we began to see crystals forming, we put it in an ice bath for about 10 minutes to let it cool and let all the precipitate come out. We'll then filter the precipitate until we get a dry form of pure salicylic acid. Once the filtration is done, we can put it in the oven for about 30 minutes to let it dry completely, and then we'll proceed to step 8, which is our melting point determination for our pure and our crude samples of salicylic acid. So this is our melting point apparatus. To turn it on, you turn the thermometer on at the top, and then the light can be turned on, and the dial can be set to about 4. Now we take our 2 capillary tubes. One end is open and one end is closed. And just mark which tube you're going to use for your pure sample and which tube you're going to use for your crude. So I marked this one with black for a crude sample. And to get our sample in the capillary tubes, you take the open end and tap it lightly against your sample until some of the sample sticks inside the tube. Then you can tap the tube lightly on the desk, and then take this nice big long tube and just drop your tube down through it until all the sample falls to the bottom. You may have to do this a few times. We can do the same procedure for the crude sample so that we have 2 samples, our pure and our crude. And then we put them in the melting point apparatus. And watch through the window until they start melting, and record the starting temperature and the ending temperature of their melting range.